In August 1997, a small team at UK developer Rare released a game that would not only help to define the Nintendo 64, but would reinvent an entire genre, changing the face of first-person shooters forever. That game was GoldenEye 007. In this video we'll hear from some of the developers behind its success and find out how the team came together, how the concept evolved and what went into its creation. I'm on a retro tip and this is the making of GoldenEye. Rare itself was founded in 1985 by two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper. They had previously established another hugely successful company, Ultimate Play the Game, which was a defining developer in the 8-bit computer years, particularly for the ZX Spectrum. Rare was initially an offshoot of Ultimate, but when Ultimate was sold to US Gold in 1985, the Stampers began releasing games as Rare. This was the start of a long-standing relationship with Nintendo, with them developing over 40 titles for the NES between 1986 and 1992. That's a lot of games, but everything changed for Rare in 1994. After investing in some state-of-the-art and costly SGI or silicon graphics machines, Rare started to create 3D graphics using the hardware, which could then be pre-rendered onto Super Nintendo carts. Their demo impressed Nintendo so much that they bought a stake in Rare, a not insignificant 25% at the time, and offered Rare the chance to create a Super Nintendo game using this technology based on Nintendo characters. Rare chose Donkey Kong and developed Donkey Kong Country. Using this advanced hardware and techniques, Rare shot to the forefront of UK video game development, and Donkey Kong Country demonstrated an unprecedented quality of graphics on the console. Rare became a second-party developer for Nintendo, and between Donkey Kong Country and Rare's purchase by Microsoft in 2002, Rare developed exclusively for Nintendo consoles in the home, many of which were also published by Nintendo. Soon enough, Rare started developing for Nintendo's upcoming console.
And with an eye to the future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality.
Initially codenamed Project Reality and later the Ultra 64, the Nintendo 64 would take the capabilities of the SGI hardware to new heights. Several strictly segregated teams at Rare would work on different games for the new console, with one team working on a licensed game.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
First, let's meet the team who would be working on the Bond game. GoldenEye's credits were tongue-in-cheek film-style roles to complement the fact that it was a film tie-in, so I'll explain both those and each team member's actual role on the game. Produced and directed by Martin Hollis, Martin headed the team, so this credit is perhaps the most accurate. Martin studied computer science at Cambridge. Director of photography Mark Edmonds, who worked on the engine and underlying code. Mark had some programming experience, although none in games. Martin and Mark were the game's main programmers. Original screenplay by Dr. David Doak. David was responsible for the story and level structure and the gameplay mechanics in general. Dr. Doak is a real doctor, having studied biochemistry at Oxford and was a research scientist prior to joining Rare. Scenic art director Karl Hilton. Karl designed many of the levels, the weapons and the UI. Karl's background was in architecture. Production designer Duncan Botwood. Duncan built many of the levels and worked on the motion capture for the character animations. He was also the motion capture actor for all of them. Costume designer Brett Jones, often credited as B. Jones, another very apt credit as Brett designed all of the characters and also worked on the motion capture. Second unit director Stephen Ellis. Steve did some programming for the game, famously being instrumental in creating the multiplayer mode last minute and for coding a fully functional ZX Spectrum emulator into the game. Original music by Graeme Norgate, who did all the sound effects, and Grant Kirkhope. Graeme and Grant each composed roughly half of the game's soundtrack. There were of course several other team members with more minor roles, but this team of 9 were the core team behind GoldenEye.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it was a very small team. Obviously, I came on board first. Martin Hollis, the team lead for GoldenEye, came along and said, "Oh, we might be doing a James Bond game. Do you like James Bond?" And yeah, I mean, I love James Bond, so I said, completely honest, I said, yeah, absolutely love James Bond. Seen all the movies, know them all by heart. So I turned the next day. I was basically moved out into this other building where there was myself, Martin Hollis, and Mark Edmonds, who were the two main programmers, and that was it to start with. That was the three of us. I mean, GoldenEye was hard. We spent it took 2.5 years to make, and we worked unbelievably long hours. So we were at the studio from 8 in the morning until 10 at night, making this thing. And in those days, with the way Rare was funded, we were really left alone, and we didn't do any designs before we made the game, and the whole thing was made on the fly by us, just going, this would be cool and this would be cool, and playing other games and going, oh, that's really fun, we should do something like that. And having that ability, being given the freedom and the time to just experiment and play around with stuff. There were so many talented people there, and you got to see what was going on, and we had that freedom to create because Nintendo backed the studio so well. So there wasn't this sort of pressure. I mean, there was pressure to deliver, but not pressure to deliver to a budget and to a time scale. It was like, make the game good first and foremost.
Well, I can tell you why we did end up with those titles was because Rare at the time didn't want to put credits on at all. It was just going to say by Rare Limited, but Martin Hollis fought for it, and the way we got round it was to become film creditors, if you like, and the closest thing to what I was doing was costume designer, because I was building all of the characters and putting them in costumes. So when it came down to it, I built all of the characters, did all of the animation, most of the animation cleanup, 2 of the backgrounds, and sorted out the sort of look of the front interface.
Just went to the GoldenEye block one evening just to sort of see what they'd been up to. Martin was showing me the sort of flying around the levels that they sort of the early stages of what they had. There was no gameplay or anything at that point. It was just a fly through. I mentioned how much fun it would be to work on it and how much it would mean to me to do it. And I worked with Martin on Killer Instinct, so he knew what I was capable of, I suppose. And so that's sort of where that started. Still really early days. I mean, we didn't have any hardware or anything like that. No one really knew what the final specs were going to be. So there was a lot of just sort of finger in the air and thinking, well, it's probably going to be able to do this and do that. So it was a case of just writing some music and hoping that it would work in the when we actually got the hardware in the end and stuff like that.
What's interesting about the team is that they were very inexperienced. In fact, of the 9 core members, only 4 had worked on a game before, and only 1 as a major role. Martin Hollis had worked on Killer Instinct, Graeme Norgate had done music for Killer Instinct and for Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy, Grant Kirkhope worked on Donkey Kong Land 2, Karl Hilton did some art for Killer Instinct, but other than that, the team were all video game virgins. Several were artists or musicians who knew nothing about making games. Karl was an architect, and David Doak had come on as system administrator for the Silicon Graphics hardware.
The whole thing about GoldenEye is that none of us had made a game before, apart from Graeme Norgate. Everybody else hadn't made a game. So no one knew what they were doing. It was all just like, suck it and see, so we all had a go with it. And sometimes that's why the best games are made, because you don't know what the boundaries are. You just go with your gut, right? And I think that's why Rare was so great. Rare went with its gut so many times.
The latter part of my degree and my PhD was working on protein structure determination. There's a computational side to that, so I got involved in that. And then particularly to look at these 3D models, in those days it was big, expensive, fairly specialized machines. And Silicon Graphics were one of the manufacturers of those machines. As a kind of byproduct of what I was doing, I did a lot of system administration for these Silicon Graphics machines. And I got back into following games again. And Edge was one of the magazines that everyone, it was like the nerd's face magazine, really, back in those days. And they were always advertising at Rare because they were expanding their teams to do the N64 stuff. And then there was an advert which was for programmers, artists, and we need a system administrator for our Silicon Graphics network. So I applied for it, not really expecting anything to come off it. was interviewed by Martin Hollis and Mark Betteridge. Mark was one of the directors at Rare, and Martin was leader of the GoldenEye team at the time. And they offered me the job. And as I got to know them later, they were saying, well, I was the only choice. They didn't have anyone else who had the same experience. With the move to the 3D stuff, there was a general feeling that they needed to. I mean, certainly on the engineering side, they needed to get people who had more formal C programming kind of learning and stuff and things. And then, and there was a core of the mathematical stuff, because at the time the engines were writing the engine and doing all of the maths for that. I mean, it's fairly basic kind of vector maths and stuff, but it was slightly specialized at the time. So Martin and Mark Edmonds were both comp sci guys from Cambridge. B and Karl had done what was probably almost like the first wave of computer graphics degrees, because that was an incredibly new field. It was an insane hothouse of talent, Rare, at that time.
GoldenEye was my first job. Yeah, I mean, I'd never worked in computer graphics or anything like that at all, so coming into Rare was completely different. I mean, I had to learn the new software, which was Alias Wavefront at the time, version 4, which I had to learn from scratch, from a book and from a set of videotapes. And I had 3 months in a room on my own, learning how to do everything. Martin came into the office one day and said, okay, you're on this team. And that's literally how it started. I mean, it was the dumbest of lucks.
What I took along was all my architecture drawings and the animations that I'd done, but also lots of architecture stuff. And I'm into photography, so I'd done a lot of photography. So they offered me a job as an environment artist because I clearly understood buildings and light. I
mean, after the initial kind of wow, I'm here, I got quite frustrated with it, because I enjoyed games. I talked with everyone about games. But I wasn't making games. I was the guy who came and crawled around under your desk, or fixed your monitor, or did this, whatever. So I was gonna quit. And Martin Hollis and Simon Farmer, who was like kind of production manager at Rare, got wind of the fact. It was like, well, you don't leave. I said, well, it's been great, but I'm not really enjoying it. They said, well, what would make you stay? And I said, well, the worst thing is not being involved in the games. And Martin said, well, maybe you could come on GoldenEye. So there was a kind of transition period where I was doing a bit of programming on GoldenEye. Not clever programming. the safe parts. And still doing system administration, but just gradually. And then that programming turned into being more focused on getting the level design working and in the single player game, really. I mean, if there's a part of GoldenEye which is my part, it is all the level set up in the single player game and the AI scripting for that.
GoldenEye was the first thing that I worked on, but I mean, so to start with, for like the first month probably, I was just in the main farmhouse, like in a little room upstairs, and they asked me to work on some graphics stuff, just working on the PC, like animating a character and creating skinned joints. So I had no idea what it was going to be used for or whatever. So I guess that was going okay. And so then I moved over to the barn, the GoldenEye barn. So it was just Martin and Karl were over there at the time. So then, so I moved over to join them. I guess the company trusted us just to get on with it, and that probably instilled trust in us, or confidence in us.
The location was unassuming, to say the least. Based out of Twycross in Leicestershire, Rare headquarters was remote, a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in the countryside.
There were different barns, so there was like the main farmhouse, and there were different barns which different teams were in, working on different games.
It really is in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, there's nowhere around it. And when we were at the farmhouse, there was chickens running around all the time, and there was 2 dogs. So there was probably about 100 odd people there, maybe. I mean, the thing is, you just didn't see them, quite honestly. That was the thing. You couldn't get into any of the other buildings, and you didn't really interact with people that weren't on your team.
Licensed games had a terrible reputation by the time that Rare acquired the license, and expectations were low. The original concept was to create a side-scrolling platform game for the Super Nintendo. Martin Hollis was keen to head up the project, but only if the game could be developed for Nintendo's new 64-bit console.
It was early 95. We'd just finished Killer Instinct. Yeah, I can remember having a coffee with Martin, and he was talking about having been asked about doing this game, and I'm sure you know it was at that point it was going to be a Super Nintendo game, so I'd imagine, you know, we'd be looking at a side-scrolling beat 'em up or something, you know, as all film tie-ins were back in those days.
We weren't sure initially. I mean, we there was myself, Mark, and Martin, and we were sort of talking about what we could do. Because obviously originally it was supposed to be a Super NES game, and Martin had only taken on the project on the condition that we could do it on the N64, because Rare knew that was coming. We've been told by Nintendo that it was on its way, and we said, well, we don't want to do a SNES game, we want to do, you know, the SNES, the new Super Nintendo game, because Project Reality, as it was called at the time, because we knew it was going to be 3D, and we thought, well, 3D is much more interesting. So we were looking at 3D. I mean, initially we were talking about things like, do you remember the original GTA games, which was they were sort of pseudo 3D downward camera, pacing camera, because it was kind of like Spy Hunter as well. So we're thinking, well, you could do, you know, car chases and guns. It could be a sort of cross between GTA 3 and Spy Hunter.
The game then evolved to an on-rail shooter.
We were going to the local town and playing, there was a Sega arcade there, and we were playing a lot of Virtua Cop. And we thought, actually, Virtua Cop would be great. And we were playing a lot of Doom as well, and we thought, first-person shooters, fun. But we didn't know what the console could do, and we assumed it wasn't going to be that powerful. So we figured maybe an on-rails like Virtua Cop, where you'd be taken around through the whole sort of movie on rails, and you'd shoot the bad guys, and, you know, and you could set everything up quite nicely. So that was our initial second plan, was, we'll do that. And we went down, Rare gave us some money, and we went down and played the whole way through Virtua Cop from start to finish.
Eventually it was decided that GoldenEye would be a first-person shooter, a genre which at the time was still commonly known as Doom clones.
Once the console turned up, the first version of the console turned up, and Martin and Mark started playing with it, they said, actually, I think we can take it off rails and we can actually make it like Doom. We can actually move you through it however you want to go. So the very first level I ever built was the underneath of the big dish at the end, Arathabo. And that had been built with a track in mind, so that you went through and followed this path through it. So the first thing we did was turn that off, and then I had to go back in and sort of start ripping stuff out to make it cheaper, so that the whole thing actually could run at a decent frame rate, because I'd done some stuff that was really expensive, but it didn't matter because the camera was only supposed to point in certain directions. But suddenly it was like, oh no, you can turn and look anywhere you want. This is going to be a free roaming first-person shooter game.
So there wasn't anything running at that stage at all. But the plan for it was going to be an on-rail shooter, and then it just slowly evolved, because Doom was on PC, was like big at the time, and we were all playing it, so it just sort of moved towards that over time.
That was how first-person games were evolving at that time. You know, how do you make it not just about running around with red, blue, and yellow key cards and stuff? I mean, I have tremendous respect for Doom. The early Dooms were transformative, really. I mean, there was nothing before them. But there's not really the story is you kill monsters.
The James Bond license is a complicated beast, but it seems that Rare had free reign to use not only almost anything from the film, but almost anything from the entire Bond franchise.
Well, as far as I was concerned, I had complete and utter freedom. I could do whatever I wanted.
This licensing deal also explains the addition of the two non-GoldenEye Bond levels at the end of the game, Aztec and Egyptian. As they were free to use almost anything Bond, they designed these levels based on Moonraker and Live and Let Die. They also incorporated elements from other Bond films like Scaramanga's Golden Gun.
The rights were for the whole of the Bond franchise, which is why the multiplayer has stuff from other movies in it, which is why we did, some of the old, the Aztec and from Moonraker and things like that. Because I wouldn't want to do that. So it was great. Yeah, it was like full access to the whole Bond universe. Fantastic.
Despite the broad license agreement, some aspects were eventually cut from the game or toned down. This is to be expected, seeing as there were several parties to appease, most notably MGM, the Bond license holders, and Nintendo themselves.
Late in the day, some people from MGM came to, basically, I think it was like a sign-off procedure, and they were just really surprised that we'd made a violent shooting game. Quite pleased with it, but worried that it was overly violent. So there were things that were cut. Some of the death animations were toned down, and then also they completely vetoed the other Bonds. As I understand it, the sticking point would have been Connery, because Connery's contracts would have predated any envisaging that it would go into a video game. So there may have been some grey area there, legally. If Connery ended up in a negotiation, then Moore and Dalton would end up in a negotiation, and it would be, well, what's he getting? MGM could look and say, well, you don't need this. Why are you just adding cost?
Yeah. I built Roger Moore, Sean Connery, and Timothy Dalton. Somewhere there is a cartridge with all 4 Bonds in them. Somewhere.
Later on, obviously there's the famous thing about the 4 Bonds. We discovered we didn't have rights to all the Bond because they were famous actors, so we didn't have rights to Sean Connery and those other, and Roger Moore. So they were in the game originally because we thought we did, and then we were told, no, you've got to take those out. We weren't allowed to use the Eurocopter because that was owned by whoever builds the Eurocopter, so it got renamed to the Eurochopper. And the guy who played the CIA agent, Jack Wade, can't remember the name of that, but we didn't have rights to his face either, so he was in the game and got taken out.
The only restriction that came in once was right at the end when we were doing the multiplayer levels, and I built Baron Samedi. And Baron Samedi has a cross around his neck, and I had to take that off because we weren't allowed religious symbols. So he just has a sort of like pill shape, and that's the only thing I was ever asked to change, because it was, religious symbols. I think the only other thing was we didn't have female Moonraker guards, because I think I built them, but they didn't want to shoot women, generally speaking, unless they were in the game. They just didn't want random female characters getting shot.
Of course, GoldenEye on N64 wasn't released until August of 1997, almost 2 years after the release of the film in November 1995. For reference material, the team got to visit the GoldenEye set several times.
I think it was the first day that I was in the new building, and Martin came in and he had a copy of the script, which had all these stamps on it to show where it was gone, because obviously it was still being filmed, so that was top secret. It was like, you must look after this. So I was allowed to read through the script, and he came in holding a 35mm camera, and he said, oh, do you know about cameras? So I said, yeah, I do photography quite a lot. So he said, oh, great. He said, we're going to go down to the studio tomorrow. You can take the camera and take all the photos. So, basically spent the day being chaperoned by one of the producers around the sort of all the different sets, and we got to go back, obviously behind everything, and take photos of all of the sets that they weren't using at the time, and props and the costumes and things like that. And then at that point we had spent absolutely no time on any kind of production, so we had no idea what we wanted. So I just basically took photographs of absolutely everything, and this was obviously 35mm film. So I had rolls and rolls of film with me, and I was photographing anything and everything. We don't know what we're going to make yet, but you better make sure we've got everything we can find. And they gave us blueprints for the sets as well, so we could see the layouts of things like the archives and stuff. So it's like, okay, this is how the set is being built, and this is what it's going to look like. And also, obviously, they were building sets and then tearing them down. The first time we went there, they were still building out on the main runway, because it's an old helicopter factory originally for Rolls-Royce, Leavesden, where they. And it was the first time it had been used, I think, for filming. The Rolls-Royce factory had shut down and was being turned into a studio. That first time we went, they were still building all the St. Petersburg streets. So once that was built, we came back and took all those photos for the St. Petersburg stuff. Because half of that was filmed in St. Petersburg, and the other half was filmed in Leavesden on the runway.
We saw the Russian St. Petersburg sets, where the tank goes around, and we also saw the snow set that you see the plane take off at right at the beginning. We saw the set where, the interior of the Archangel's control room. I think that's about it. Oh, we went into the costume department as well, and we saw some of the costumes on the rails and stuff. At the time, we had a digital camera, and I must say, this is what, 1994? Digital cameras doesn't exist, and this digital camera was huge. It was like a brick. It was just this massive SLR. As a keen photographer, I knew how to use an SLR camera, so I took a lot of the photographs. And Statue Park we went round as well. Yes, we had tons of photographs from Statue Park and also of St. Petersburg. Not so much in the costume department because it was literally just a walkthrough and all the costumes were hanging up anyway, so it wasn't really something we could take photos of.
A lot of the reference material came from an unlikely and rather fortuitous source, the personal Bond collection of B. Jones.
Don't forget, at this point, there was no internet. There is, what stuff have I got in my collection that I have front and side faces of? My collection of James Bond memorabilia, which is extensive, I literally looked through it for all the best photo references. I mean, all the pictures of the James Bonds in all the folders are all from my James Bond collection. You know, they're just photographs and scanned in from there. There's magazines, you know, the making of GoldenEye and as many GoldenEye reference books as I could find, which I still have, and they've still got, you know, little bits of paper in them to show where we took information from them.
The film was released in late '95, so one would assume that this was a great asset to the team in terms of design reference, but maybe not.
We went to lots and lots of very early showings of it to sort of see what it was like, but it was weird because we'd been in that view for about over a year. So when you see something like James Bond escaping through the catacombs right at the beginning, it was like being in the film because we'd been doing that so much, and it was like, oh, what's the wall like? What's the floor like? You know, we were literally in the premiere looking at the textures and seeing what was going on because that was our reference points. So yeah, we didn't ever get a videotape of it. So there was no sort of taking things from a video.
As mentioned earlier, Rare were using the expensive Silicon Graphics hardware to produce GoldenEye's artwork. In 1995, the SGI Onyx began being used to develop for the Nintendo 64. These units cost hundreds of thousands.
We all had either quite high-end machines. I had the big one because I was doing a lot of 3D modelling, so I had an Onyx 2 Reality engine, which was the size of a small fridge and sat beneath my desk. Yeah, I really loved it. I mean, amazing machines. At the time, I was just staggered by this machine. I took pictures of it and sent to all my friends saying, look what I'm using. You know, I've got this Onyx 2 Reality engine, which had some amazing games. In the evenings, we'd sit and play. They had network games on it. There was a flight simulator where you could do dogfighting, all 3D, which I'd never seen before. There was a brilliant tank game. We had emulators that were supposed to emulate the N64 on these machines. Obviously, when the console actually turned up, it didn't have anywhere near as much memory or stuff, like because they never do. So, you know, the game that was running on those machines had to be significantly sort of, particularly the graphics were, the textures and stuff were all cut back down and scale back down, but it wasn't bad. I mean, it looked good.
At the time, you don't know it's new technology. You just know that that's the job you're in and this is the software they're using, so you better learn it because you're going to be using it. So it's not really that kind of thought. It's like, okay, I better learn this because I want to stay here for my job.
The Nintendo 64 hardware, as well as the cartridge-based media, also brought with it challenges in a time when most consoles were transitioning to CD.
GoldenEye. Load a rumble pack.
You know how to use one of these?
And see how it feels when 007 meets N64.
A lot of it was just trying to make things actually fit on the Nintendo 64 as well. So you couldn't put in loads of polygons, so it was just making sure that everything was cheap enough to run. And even then, it ended up running at quite a slow frame rate compared to modern games. So one thing was, which Martin Hollis was working on. So he worked on a virtual memory system for Nintendo 64, but I guess it runs similarly to virtual memory on a PC now. And it was basically some parts of the game code would swap in and out of the memory depending on what was running at that time. And so he did that system just to save memory so it could be used on other things. Yeah, so maybe the intro sequence to the game, so that would load in at the start and it would probably unload later on when you're actually in a level. So there are certain techniques that you can use in programming. So you basically pre-allocate chunks of memory, which can be used for various things. There would be a chunk of memory allocated for the player's weapon. You'd have to better load the graphics for any weapon into that same fixed-sized chunk of memory. So yeah, so it's basically large enough to load in whatever was the most expensive weapon. Whenever the camera switched to an external perspective, so third person, then instead of loading the weapon into that memory, it would load the graphics for the player character, for James Bond, into that memory. Yeah, so that's like another little trick, because so you'd either be displaying the first person weapon, or you'd be displaying the third person view of James Bond. Yes, another trick was so basically using like a scripting system for the AIs, for the enemies, which was a lot cheaper than doing it in C code itself. So it's basically just like a list of instructions, like byte data. Yeah, so it's just like a very simple programming language, but it took up less memory.
You could specify different sizes of cartridges, but they cost, obviously, the memory cost. So if you said to Nintendo, well, we think it's going to be this big, then they'd say, well, that will require this size cartridge and it will cost this much, which means from a Rare point of view, they were going to get royalties, but obviously the cost of the cartridges came out of the royalties. So it was like, so there was a lot of pressure for us to get the game onto the smallest cartridge possible, but I think I'm pretty sure we ended up using the biggest one that was available.
The team had to start from scratch, with Martin and Mark writing tools that would translate everything to the Nintendo 64.
There's just a ton of hidden stuff going on in the code side of all games. People just don't realise. So yeah, for GoldenEye, there's pretty much nothing. So the artists were using Alias, which became Maya. So there were some tools for the artists, but there wasn't a pipeline for how to get the graphics and display them on the console. Yeah, so I did a lot of that, basically converting graphics, converting animations into a format so that they could actually be used on the console. But then there were no level editors for setting up enemies on a level, so we just kludged together some makeshift system. So using there's a program called Multigen. So Nintendo had their own version called Ningen, but so we were using that to set up the levels, position things on the levels. And if any of the designers or artists remember this, they'll probably just have nightmares, because it was just such a horrible system compared to all the modern. So compared to things like Unreal Engine or Unity, I mean, they just make the whole process seamless now, and just light years ahead of what we were working with at the time. I'm pretty sure when we started on the Nintendo 64, there wasn't even a proper debugger for the code. So the only way to debug things was to display text on the screen saying where you were in the code, things like that. Yeah, so the only way for us to test things in the game, so it was running on development kits. Just to test the graphics, you'd have to run the game on your development console, and then so you'd be running around almost playing it, just to look around that level. So it would have been quite a long time until we were then actually getting enemies in the game that were reacting to you. Yeah, so it would have built up quite slowly to start with, because we were just building everything from scratch. Just getting some graphics on screen first of all. The very basic thing, it would just be getting one triangle just displayed on the middle of the screen, rotating or something, and then trying to get some graphics in that Karl had built, and then being able to move around, getting things like collisions happening, so you couldn't walk through walls. Yeah, and then some AIs at some point as well, or some enemies that would react and try and shoot you, and that you could shoot. So it just built up over quite a long time.
Karl Hilton and Duncan Botwood were responsible for designing and creating GoldenEye's levels. Contrary to most games, the levels would be designed first, based on the scenes and locations in the film.
So Karl had a background as an architect. Yeah, so I think Martin basically said to him, make some realistic levels. So there wasn't necessarily a big plan for what the levels should be. As far as I remember, he was just making whatever he wanted.
You know, in terms of what I built, in terms of environments, I built most of the environments. Duncan Bott, with the designer, built some of the layouts initially and did some texturing and then handed it over to me later. But other than that, it was me doing pretty much, I allowed a few months for each environment and just powered through them all. And then, we didn't have a 2D artist. So if you look at GoldenEye, all of the 2D art, all the sort of the UI stuff is all actually 3D models that have been rendered flat, so that was me doing all of that. And same with all the icons for the bullets and stuff. It was just me rendering little bullets in Alias and then flattening them out and going in and hand editing them to try and make them look a bit better. I mean, the resolution is super low, so you had very little to work with. So yeah, it was quite thrown together. Same with the folders and the files. That was a 3D model that I made. The On Her Majesty's HSS Secret Service crest is actually the crest of my passport that I scanned in, which I don't think probably we're allowed to do, but it was, making video games in those days was fun because it was such a small team, and so you had to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, they weren't boxed out by some designer saying this is what happens in this level. It was, there is this environment in the film and some stuff happens in it in the film, so there are some key rooms maybe, or some key vistas that you see. But generally, it's just build that space. For example, the bunker in the film, there's that key room with all the consoles and stuff in it, which we kind of don't really have. But there was a room with a big monitor wall. But I think in the film, it's got lots of desks and rows or something. I mean, like the archives is another good example. Yeah, so in that, it's archives with bookshelves and stuff. And it has a particular kind of Soviet industrial look to it. But Karl just built a building. So so Karl and Brett and Eddie Smith were just building things. Duncan built the caverns. There was an idea in that you'd be pursuing Trevelyan or something. Water caverns isn't in the film. The idea was that the Arathabro dish was full of water, and then it was drained. So the water must have gone somewhere. It's supposed to be a place where all this water can go, and then the water level might come up, but it didn't get done.
We had all the blueprints, so the first thing I would do is basically build what we knew was in the movie. But obviously, film sets are often quite simple. They often just had 1 or 2 rooms and a corridor, and that wasn't anywhere near enough for the game. All the back walls and stuff that were missing, because that's where the cameras and everything were, obviously I'd fill all that in and create a space. I'd sort of just try and fill it out naturally how it would feel right, and then I'd usually send it to Dave, Doak, the designer at that point, or Duncan, the other designer, and say, this is what I've got so far, what do you want to do here? The performance was so difficult. I had to try and work. We couldn't have long corridors with lots of rooms opening off them because it wouldn't draw that. So I was trying to work out how to make sure that the thing didn't look too expensive and that we weren't drawing too much. And Dave and Duncan were trying to work out, what you could do in each space that was interesting. So obviously we had the script, so we knew what Bond was going to be doing. In fact, halfway through the film came out. So the first half of developing the game, we knew what was going to happen because of the script, and the second half we'd actually seen the movie. So a lot of it was just like, well, let's recreate what happens in the movie, but we need a bit more because the movie's only an hour and a half, hour and 50 minutes long or whatever it is, and we need 12, 14 hours of gameplay. So it was sort of, okay, well, we know Bond does this in the film. What else can we do around that makes it more interesting? And so, that was when we started adding in extra rooms and doing extra bits on top of it. Some stuff, because it wasn't really enough in the movie to make the full game, we ended up inventing some new locations. External stuff that's hinted at the film, but you don't get to see, or was completely stuff where we just made stuff up, like the missile silos, So it was good fun, and I think one of the reasons why it played well in the end was because we were able to prototype those sorts of spaces very quickly and play them, and then go, yeah, that doesn't really work, let's change it, and try and get spaces that were interesting.
Brett Jones was solely responsible for designing the game's characters.
I mean, it's fortunate it's such low res information, really, because when we were coming to create the costumes, again, because there's no Photoshop, there's no drawing or painting any of this, I had to model all of these things in a kind of 2.5D, then take a render of them, and then attach them to the characters. So, I made lots and lots of tuxedos and costumes and that peculiar shirt that Boris is wearing. They're all created in 2.5 dimensions. You know, it's like a slightly curved object, so you've got a bit of light coming on the front. And then it would be put onto the polygonal character in this amazing 3-point positioning system. Bottom left, bottom right, top right, and that was it. Alias Wavefront was our 3D modeling and animation package. No Photoshop, so everything was created within that. And then we used something called Ningen, which was essentially this texture placement package. So we would import our models into that and then attach textures to it. I didn't really have much to do on that, because with characters, I was told, well, you've got 5 textures of, well, no, let's see now. There was 6 textures on the hands, there was 5 on the heads, and then there was maybe 4 on the rest of the body. So there would be a front and a back. There wouldn't be anything about the sides at all, ever. And these were something like 24 by 48 pixels. You know, they were tiny little images just put on. The thing is, Ningen actually had a pixel editor, so you could paint pixels, and they were really big, of course, because you've only got a picture that's 24 by 48. So if something didn't match up, you could pick up the pixel editor and just pick the right color and make it match. It's incredible, isn't it? And actually, I chose all those extra 4 characters because I had all the reference, and these were the people I had the best reference for. I also wanted to get some female characters, I wanted to get a black character in there, and I wanted to get Oddjob in there because he was cool. So yeah, all the sort of stuff around Oddjob is my fault because I chose him.
Brett used photos of the staff at Rare to map to the faces of characters in the game.
It was, generally speaking, anybody I could find. I mean, there's builders in there, there's plumbers, there's the staff from the canteen, there's the groundsman, there's the IT guy, there's even a couple of the kids that were hanging around Rare at the time. You know, it was literally anybody.
And Dr. Doak famously appeared in Facility as a double agent.
That Dr. Doak objective, it's a dressed up door key objective, really. It could just be a key, but obviously it fits the fiction that you're meeting a double agent or something. It's just a joke because that facility is like a lab stuff, and it's got all the scientists in it, because I was a scientist. So I think I put myself, forced it to use my head, because you could do that. You could force a character to be a particular character. When I did it, it was entirely in the expectation that it would get taken out. Karl and Brett put their names all over the place in the game. There's lots of KHs and BJs in any place where there's an opportunity to stick some random letters on. They'll be there. So it was equivalent to that, but it was too obvious, really. So I was expecting it to be taken out, and Tim saw it and told Martin to take it out. And then I think Martin put it back in again because we were a bit rebellious. I mean, being told to do something was a sure way to make us try to do it. And when we put it back in, it was quite late in the day, so already the string tables had gone off for localization. So that was like a separate file that went off and obviously got localized. And we made some ridiculous argument that it would cause trouble because not only would we have to change the English file, we'd have to change the other ones. It stayed in, which is good. It's been a source of pleasure.
The character movements were all captured very early on using a magnetic motion capture rig called Flock of Birds from Ascension Technologies.
Flock of Birds is essentially a magnetic capturing system, as opposed to these days where they use optical systems where you've just got coloured balls, reflective balls stuck on people. Magnetic systems are essentially a wetsuit with a load of magnets tied onto it, and then these magnets have cables up to the main system. So as you can imagine, you can only go so far, and if you went too far, you literally pulled the unit off the wall, because it was up high on the wall. And the thing with the room we were in, it had nice flooring and everything, so you could do rolls, but it had magnetic pieces. It had metal actually in a lot of the room. So yes, there was a lot of interference with it.
So Duncan and Brett primarily did all of the motion capture, probably in, I guess, I don't know, like 94, 95 or something. I can't remember when they did it. And it was all with the most dreadful first generation motion capture technology. A big umbilical that went up behind you and then had sensors all over your body. So incredibly unwieldy to move in. And they collected a set of data for everything they imagined we could possibly need. By the time I was involved, there wasn't even the opportunity really to go back and capture more motion data, because the flock thing had been disassembled. It was the room it used to be in was used for something else. That was Duncan in that godforsaken flock of birds motion capture thing, trying to do these big theatrical, just brilliant. I mean, they're really, really good. But then also the data that came out of that stuff was absolutely crap. So Brett had to take it all and clean it all up.
I did all the cleanup and reanimation of that, and Duncan Botwood was my was my model for all of that. What we didn't want to do is have any sort of anticipation for the character going to be shot or hit or what have you. So Duncan had to do this mostly with his eyes closed, and I would then go up and belt him in various places, and he would react. So if you see somebody getting shot in the shoulder and they do this, it's because I've just punched him in the shoulder. Duncan, he gave me a list. So we would get, guard walks, a couple of different ways, guard holding gun, guard holding, automatic rifle, guard holding handgun, and I'd get this huge list of things, and then I'd get shot in the shoulder, recover, shot in the shoulder and die, shot in the shoulder, fall forwards, and essentially it was this huge list of things to do just to fill out. So, I mean, they were very quick to do once we'd got the system up and running, because you only generally needed one or two versions of it to get something that worked.
Designing the levels and characters was only the start. The real key to GoldenEye's success, certainly in the single player campaign, was its mission structure and objectives.
When Karl built the dam, he built that tunnel inside the dam, which is of no purpose at all in the film. I mean, in the film he runs out in the dam and jumps off it. So there's that, and then that whole thing, well, why don't we put a secret room with computers in there with those objectives? I think one of the things about it, why it ends up working so well, is that when we were doing the objectives in the levels, we kind of sat down and said, well, every level ought to have five objectives, because one of the things we noticed was we always had this fear that the game was way too short, because particularly the dam, it's if the dam was the film, then it literally is that 20 seconds you get and you run and jump off the dam. So it was like, this is a nightmare. It's like, we can't have a game which has got 20-minute long levels. It's just, that's not enough game. So we needed to make things to make them more interesting. So we put all of this stuff in. So all the levels were being built with these objectives, and also the default difficulty of the game was 008, was the hardest difficulty. And then the simpler parts of the game, we dumbed down the AI until we thought it was laughably easy, and took out objectives until we thought there was nothing to do. Then when it goes out into the world and people see the game, it feels like this evolving toy box that just gets better. It's like you play the game and then, but now you go back and there's these other things you can do, and actually the guys are better. That was very pleasing how well that worked out. Every review of GoldenEye that talks about the single player would say it's like, well, it's amazing because it just grows and it's just got this amazing inventiveness. Whereas we looked at it and said, well, actually it's not. It's what it is, and then we stripped it down. It feels very Nintendo as well. That it's kind of like it's like the Mario Stars. Mario 64 was obviously an amazing revolutionary game, but that whole idea that you go back and replay the levels, almost like you've made a different choice personally as to what your objectives are. Yeah. So the gadgets were also good because they tied into it was a good thing for the objectives because you could make objectives. But a lot of the objectives, when you look at them, I mean, they're all, Mario stars, the red stars, but they've got different names. In this level, the red stars are called components of some tracking device or whatever. Take that thing over there and press this button, and then it turns into this thing, and then you take it over there and you give it to him. It's like, so lots of, simple fetch quests and stuff and things.
This was really a backwards way of developing a game, as the norm would be for the levels to be designed around the story and missions. As the levels were for the most part fleshed out first, it gave GoldenEye a sense of realism and afforded the player a sense of freedom in how they would approach each level. This helped immerse the player in the world of James Bond. Many of the missions and objectives hinged on specific enemy and NPC behaviours, so the AI was integral to the gameplay.
So things like just walking around, I think we came up with a few of those scripted commands which would just say, tell an AI, go to this point on a level, or go to where the player is, or run away from where the player is. So just a few simple cases. And to maybe we would have had a command like jump to the side, which would then play one of the jump animations. And then so David Doak, who was basically then taking these commands that I did, and so he would then create a script for an AI which would say, put in a command saying dodge to the side. He would probably just set it on a random chance to happen just every so often. And sometimes it would happen and it would look quite good, and sometimes it would happen and it wouldn't look good. But you tend to remember the times that it did look good. And so just using some random combinations of things, you could maybe make the enemies seem more like they were thinking more than they actually were.
The first 7-Eye bunker level, the start of that level was basically, if you any time in 95, 96 started up, went into the Bond block and saw people's screens, it would be the start of that level in the little duct, in a little circular silo thing, the door in front of you, and Bond's gun pointing at the door. Because that was when you ran the game. We always just ran G-Sev. You type in G-Sev, and that was it, just to test that the game was working. And that part of the game where you open that door and there's two guys, one facing away, there's a camera and there's an alarm and stuff, that really plays very well. Plays so well because that was the test bed for the AI. So that going out, shooting those guys, running about in there, that all worked. But you didn't have there were no objectives. Mark, basically, he wrote this kind of scripting language that connected into the movement and the shooting and all that kind of thing. You know, he built what was necessary, because you only ever built what was necessary. So he built all of the stuff for characters to go and attack the player. And then also the other little bits, the non-combat bits, like the running off to press a button. So he'd written all of that. So then I start building up the levels. I think the first one I really got stuck into was gas plant facility. So he started doing that, and then immediately it's kind of like, right, but you've got to meet up with Trevelyan, and there's no AI for characters that don't just attack you. And then it's like, well, what's he going to be doing? It's like, well, I don't know. You've got to meet up with him, and then you've got to, I don't know. Then he kind of joins your side, and then the worst thing happens is some other NPCs come in, and there's a standoff. So how do you do a standoff? Well, they've got to come in, and they've got to be not shooting at you when they come in, because then you'll shoot at them, or so somehow no shooting's got to happen. And then Trevelyan goes up, and Oromov shoots them in the head, but doesn't shoot them in the head, and then everyone attacks you. And also, there's some dialogue going on. So we just built it, steppy up. I guess the other thing is we didn't really have the concept of objectives wasn't in the original design. So then the objectives came about. So easy objectives are go somewhere. That's fine, we can do that. But go somewhere and get something from someone or interact. Get Boris to hack a computer. So I'm always surprised at the getting Boris to go and hack the computer one, because every time I see that, I think, that must have been really annoying to set up, because there's quite a lot of AI in it. And he does that thing where, if you're not pointing the gun at him, he buggers off. That's quite funny. The most nightmare thing to set up was that bloody watch where they're cutting the hole in the floor of the train. Because that thing, there's nowhere else in the game where you drop through a hole where that place has actually got a door on it before you open it, because the thing's a door. There are a few places like that where it's just all very special case kind of, hacked in. Mark and I had this brilliant dialogue, which was, I would say, well, okay, with what we've got, I can kind of fake this, but it falls apart whenever I need this thing to happen. How about a character who, like Oromon, classic example, can I have a character who aims at another character and not at Bond, not at the player? And then, you know, and then getting characters to hit marks, because if they're doing to do stuff, they need to hit a mark reliably. Mark was great because I'd say, what about maybe could we do this? And then the next day he'd say, you know, that thing you mentioned, yeah, I've done that, so you can put it in. By the end of setting up the games, we could do like the Natalia thing. You know, Natalia, I mean, although people laughed at the Natalia character, there was no precedent for that in other games. She's it's a character, okay, yeah, she gets shot sometimes, but it's a character that's running around in a gunfight, kind of following you, navigating a 3D space. Other characters, they do sometimes try to shoot at her and sometimes don't. But then by the time in the jungle, you know, she's running around doing her own thing, you know, running around shooting stuff and things. We built up this framework, and a big part of the believability of the AI is, okay, behind it there's some kind of state machines making decisions, but ultimately the player sees animations.
He would basically sit there playing a level, seeing what was good, then he would then tune and tweak the AIs and their spawn points and like the size of their hearing radius, how well they could hear the player and things like that. So each time you fired, then it would just create a larger circle around you, depending on the loudness of the weapon as well. And when that touched an AI, then they would hear you and then come looking for you. Yeah, so it's fairly simple.
For a Nintendo console, GoldenEye was a relatively mature game. Inevitably, some content was cut.
We had so much feedback, particularly from Nintendo Japan, that our game was too dark and too violent, and it wasn't a typical Nintendo game. I think there was a suggestion at one point that all Rare games were going to start with a spinning Rare logo and the sound of children laughing. That's not going to fit in with James Bond. No. So they didn't do it for our game. I can't remember if they did put it on the others in the end, but yeah, we weren't a typical Nintendo product, and we weren't a typical Rare product.
Some of the animations are, you know, the death animations are quite graphic. I mean, they clearly are people writhing in agony. But then it's kind of, you know, it's offset by I've been shot in the nuts.
So, you know, things like the AK-47, they said, no, you can't use any real-world guns. I don't know if that was a licensing thing or just a Nintendo thing, because obviously Nintendo were very children-focused, and they were worried. I mean, GoldenEye was a problem all the way because it was clearly quite a mature game, you know, and Bond kills people, and that wasn't a typical Nintendo product. So they were very concerned about the violence in the game and the killing of people. And, you know, we had, I mean, one of the versions we had, there was loads of blood in it, and we had blood coming off people, and there's absolutely no way you're doing that. So, you know, we had to switch all that off. That's why we came up with things like the Clob name, because quite late in the day they said, no, you have to rename all those weapons to made up names. So then it was a quick right, just come up with stuff we could.
It wouldn't be a James Bond game without his gadgets. The team were keen to include not only many of Bond's signature weapons, but also as many gadgets from the Bond franchise as possible.
Martin Hollis, right from early on, was very clear that, you know, he thought one of the things that made Bond good was his gadgets. You know, everyone loves Bond gadget, and so we should definitely do that, because again, first-person shooters, you go around and shoot things. So what if we have some other gadgets that do other things in the game? And that was a clear, from a game design point of view, it's an absolute gift. You know, so things like the magnetic watch and mines and anything like that. So we were very keen early on to get as many gadgets in as possible. So one of the first things I did was model those, because Mark Edmonds was the guy who did all of the weapons. The first thing he did was all the guns for shooting, and then he did all the other stuff, and it was like, let's get these working, because then we can work out what to do with them in the game. So things like the mine, yes, make it stick to the wall, brilliant, you know, and then if you shoot it, it can be on a timer, but if you shoot it, it explodes as well, brilliant, you know. And suddenly we had all these systems, so we were really keen to get as many things in. And, you know, I modeled an awful lot of things that we ended up just not having the time to really do the code for, like the piton gun that did the thing, you know, that there was a model for that, but we never got that to use that. But by putting those in early on, it opened up a whole range of things where Dave and Duncan could just say, well, we've got all these tools to play with, so we can do this and we can do this, like Bond escaping by using the magnetic watch to get the, you know, that's not in the movie, but he's got a magnetic watch, so okay, we'll use that. You know, so yeah, it was sort of serendipitous that, you know, you do something because you think it might be useful, and then it actually turns out to be much more useful than you thought it was going to be.
The gadgets often would necessitate extra game systems. I think sticking to stuff was good. I mean, all the mines things. I mean, that was. I don't think we were following a precedent for that, but the idea of you having a deployable thing. Mines are also. I think it's really funny. It's like, one of the most horrific examples of the things that people have made for warfare. I mean, mines are abhorrent. They're just absolutely hilarious in a game. Stick a mine on him, or over there where it's the where the armor pickup's going to spawn. Stick a mine there. Throwing knives. And that's so not a Bond thing. I don't know why we came up with that. It was like, another one that always gets me is the install covert modem or the tracking bug. It's so sticky. If you put it in the wrong place, that's it. You have failed. And then in a nod to 1990s game design, we don't actually tell you where to put it.
The addition of these gadgets helped to further the complexity of the objectives, adding some welcome variety, but also aiding in creating a world that felt authentically Bond. Another element essential to this, and something that is just quintessentially James Bond, was the soundtrack.
Probably the thing that I took most for granted at the time is that the sound design and the audio is absolutely amazing.
The first job I got was converting Dave Wise's music from Diddy Kong's Quest, which is Donkey Kong Country 2, to work on the original grey Game Boy. And that was a bit of a task because I didn't really know anything. I'd been using MIDI files, it was like quite friendly. And when I got to Rare, it was like, oh no, when they did the Game Boy stuff, it was all in hex. Hex is just like a black screen with white numbers. Like it's kind of programming really, and I'd never done that before. I was like, oh my God, I can't do it. Dave was really brilliant at that, so he came in and kind of showed me really quickly. Off he went. I was like, shit, I'm going to have to resign, I can't do it. So I rang Robin, we had the phones in the offices. So Robin, look, I'm going to have to resign. I said, I just can't do it, it's too hard, I just don't understand it. I've never done it before, it's incredible, He said, don't be stupid. He says, get Dave back tomorrow. Get him back to show you a bit more slowly. And write it down. So I got Dave back and I wrote it down. Step 1, press Alt 4. Step 2, whatever it was. I wrote it down a massive step-by-step, 25 steps to get a note into the bloody thing, So I gradually got round it and it worked out. I quite enjoyed it in the end. But about halfway between October and Christmas of '95, Graeme Norgate was doing GoldenEye and he was doing Blast Corps at the same time. So he was busy. He said, look, Grant, can you take over GoldenEye? Because I'm busy. And I was like, you're kidding, I'd love to do it. So it kind of was agreed that I'd do Game Boy in the morning and GoldenEye in the afternoon. So Hollis came to see me and says, all right, here's a bit of it. I got a brief kind of couple of pages of A4 with the levels on it. There was a brief description what the levels were, but that was it. And I didn't really see anything. I don't think I really paid a lot of attention to that. I read it. Duncan Botwood did it for me. So I guess things like Frigate, I thought, it's going to be a warship and all that, But I mean, I don't think I paid that much attention to it. Because all the levels are action levels, really, aren't they? Alice was just trying to write things that were atmospheric and had the Bond theme in them and were different. So I just set about writing music that I thought was appropriate for James Bond,
When we started, it was very much just a list of level names. The game was obviously late. We didn't know it was going to be late at the time, so we were working towards these deadlines that I was thinking, we're never going to hit this, but we've got to write these pieces of music or whatever. So I'd say, the first 30% of the tunes were written not knowing much about what was going on at all. And slowly, as the game started developing and progressing, you could either go back to those pieces if they didn't work, and the ones you were then working on made more sense.
I asked Hollis about it. I'd only been there a few months. I wanted that, and said to Hollis, how long should the music be? He said, well, about a minute. I didn't know how long it's supposed to be, and that was way too short. It should have been like 3 or 4 minutes per piece.
All we had was the rights to use the theme tune, so we couldn't use anything else. So we had the Monty Norman theme as arranged by John Barry, which was fine because there's so many hooks and themes in that one piece of music that just did all the work for us. I mean, you've got the guitar part, you've got the brass stabs, you've got the string progression. You just use one of those anywhere and immediately it's like, oh yeah, it's James Bond,
And the fact we had the rights to the Monty Norman theme tune, we could use that as well, because he's very litigious, Monty Norman, about his theme tune, you know. So we got that, so I could do anything we wanted to with it. It was great. And we had this double CD at the time, which was all the pop tracks that preceded the movies, the compilation. So I've listened to all of that over and over again. And I knew the scores from the John Barry stuff, because John Barry's amazing. So that was it. I just set about writing Bondy stuff, you know.
I knew that with the N64 and the hardware that we had to work with, sort of musically, I knew that trying to match what they had, match a film score, wasn't going to happen back then. And so it was a case of putting mine and Grant's touch to it, I suppose, and our style. So knowing that you weren't expected to emulate a full orchestra back then was a given as well. So maybe that was another thing that made it a little bit of an easier project to get into. Yeah, there's probably some nods to some of the other Bond songs. Maybe a little bit close at times. I know he's a lot more forward about it. He's like, oh yeah, I took the Duran Duran song here and I used the drum beat from this here and stuff like that. But I think in most places we stuck to what we were allowed to use.
Yeah, so unique bits, don't they? So I mean, you know, the kind of GoldenEye theme tune, that's all over the place in my stuff, you know. And I got I had my Faith No More drum beat for Frigate, and I stuck the kind of Duran Duran stabs over it from Due to a Kill, do like that. And I had it exactly right, and if it's too close, I had to take one of the stabs out. So that, and then I kind of, you know, that was my amalgamation of that. So it bled into everywhere, right? So, you know, like now I found there's a really famous sound that I used in my tracks. It's kind of a sonar sound, it's like a submarine sonar sound. And I found that, and that was in the soundtrack to the GoldenEye movie. And I just so happened to find that sound on my Process FX synthesizer, so I used that. I've been asked for that sound over the years so many times. People are like, "Where'd you get that sound from?" You know.
So Martin Hollis was very involved in all aspects of the development. So what I generally do is, once I'd written a piece that I felt was, you know, close enough to being finished, I'd get him in to listen to it and get his sort of feedback. It was pre-MP3 and it was pre sort of, you know, anyone that had any space on it. Our hard disks were all, you know, stupidly small, and so there was a lot of work that wasn't anywhere near the PCs or network. So it wasn't just like, you know, sending a file to everyone on the team saying, listen to this, what do you think? To do that, I'd put it onto a cassette tape and take it over and play it on one of their stereos or something. It's bonkers thinking about it now. Overall, he was fairly pleased with the first passes, if you like. There was a few points where he'd say, oh no, it's a bit too this or a bit too that. But I know he wasn't happy with the attempt to do the theme tune, because I tried it first and it wasn't really working. That kept going back to the sort of drawing board. But luckily, Grant really hit that out of the park when he did the guitar version of it. I managed to squeeze that into the N64, so that was he took what I'd started and finished it for me, if you like, because that was hard work getting that one to gel. That was the hardest one, which it was the most important one to get right.
You know, and I was pretty metal at the time on long hair, you know, because that's why we did the metal guitar version of the main theme. You know, because I had the guitar there, I was playing guitar and Killer Instinct and what have you, so it was fun to do a different take on the Bond theme with a bit of metal guitar on it, you know. But it's different then, right? Because in the Game Boy, you could just using pure FM synthesis, which is just like tones inside the machine, right? When it came to the N64, you actually put samples in the machine. So we all made up, well, because me and Graeme were sharing that project. You have a little kind of, you make it your own little MIDI orchestra. So you put all the sampled instruments that you want into the machine, and then you use those. That's how it works. So on the Game Boy, it's different. You actually physically, it's called FM synthesis. So it's like you actually have tones that you can use that are already in it. It's not like it doesn't play any samples at all. Where the snares and the N64 actually can physically get a sample, put it in the machine, and it'll play that actual real sample.
It was a nice step up. There was a lot more memory, but not that much more. I mean, the The beauty with the N64 as it went along its time is the cartridges got bigger. Something like Conker's Bad Fur Day was something like 64 meg. Blast Corps was my first title, and that was 8 meg, and I think GoldenEye was 12 meg. So that was 12 megs for the whole game, all the graphics, all the sound and everything. And I think in total, for sound and music, we had something like 700k. So yeah, it involved a lot of sort of careful planning and looping every sound that you could possibly loop, crushing the sample rate. So you've got, you don't want to go past the point where it sounds dreadful, but if it's passable, it's like, okay, well, that'll have to do. They sound quite harsh, to modern ears, but it's one of those things with video games that Dave Wise always told me. He said the music always sounds better with the graphics, and he's absolutely right. If you listen to those sort of soundtracks in isolation, they can sound quite harsh, especially the SNES stuff. But when you're playing it with the game and you've got the sound effects and everything, it kind of works. It all comes together.
Memory's really tight on the cartridge, because usually when you get a new Nintendo console, the first cartridges are really small and they get bigger as it goes on, so they get cheaper to make, right? So we had to find a way to get the guitar in there without having a whole phrase, because I have there's a really long phrase, right? It'd take too much space up. So Graeme worked out that you could have like three separate samples, and you can so 4 samples you can make the entire thing. So that by piecing together, and that should get it quite small memory. So it's only like 4 phrases in tiny little bits. We had to make lots of compromises. Things like the cymbals, you go hit a cymbal, it's got a very long decay, right? It goes for a long time. You couldn't afford that amount of memory. So we had to hit the cymbal, get the sound, and then put a loop point very close to the start of it. And then you put it, and so it goes like that. And then you put an envelope on it, so you draw an envelope. So you get the attack, you go, and you get an envelope to produce the volume. So you go, so it would sound shite, but that was the best we could do. So I had every intention of finishing GoldenEye and doing sound effects, but I got dragged off it to go and start on Dream, which became Banjo-Kazooie. So that's as far as I got, and I can't remember when that was. It was sometime in '95. Must have been a little while into '95. And then Graeme finished his games and came back and finished off GoldenEye.
I think I did all of the sound effects actually, because Grant had been moved off quite early on to work on the what became Banjo-Kazooie, but was at the time called Dream. So he wrote a ton of pieces, and then Tim Stamper was like, these are brilliant, absolutely amazing, I want you on my team. He got sort of shanghaied onto there. Sound effects wise, all of us were very wet behind the ears, and we were all new to us, and we just had this sound library of about 50 CDs or something, where you had this big telephone book directory, and you'd look up all these sound effects, and then you go and grab the CD, listen to it, and it's like, yeah, maybe, and then it's so different to today, where everything's at your fingertips, and everyone's got sort of field recorders and stuff like that. So if you want to make sounds, it's just as quick sometimes just to do it yourself. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's sort of recognizable. You'll hear them in other stuff.
Graeme and Grant evenly shared the workload when it came to composing the music, with Graeme composing for these levels and Grant for these. They both composed pieces for the Dam level, and again the music was a pretty even split for the multiplayer tracks and the extra bits like the intro, end credits, in-game menus and so on. If you want to know exactly who composed what, you can pause here and see the composer for each piece. One composer who snuck some music into the game other than Graeme and Grant was Robin Beanland, a rare employee known for his music in many of their games. He composed the elevator music in Control. First-person shooters were still in their infancy at this stage. The term first-person shooter wasn't even commonly used at this point. So the team were really experimenting with what would and wouldn't work. And of course, they had the N64's rather unusual controller to contend with.
When Rare first got one, it was in a box, so the only way you could use it was by putting your hands inside this box, so no one could see what it was or something. And then I remember another version a controller from another console, some like holes drilled into it, and the actual stick attached to that. So Nintendo were still working on it, obviously, to come up with a final design and stuff. That was probably with like a controller with like the two handles that you would hold, whereas the one that Nintendo then actually ended up with was the one with the three handles. Yeah, which is quite odd when you think about it now. So yeah, so I guess the main thing was that there was just the one stick, although we would have known that at the time. So obviously the big game on Nintendo 64 was Mario 64. So I remember that was one of the things that we talked about, that to try and make the controls in GoldenEye feel familiar to someone who was used to playing Mario. So one hand on the center prom or whatever is using the stick, so you could move around just using that single hand. And then also, so it was quite good because the trigger was underneath, so it felt quite like holding a gun.
First-person controls change over time, don't they? But that was one of the first games to do that, obviously, and the analog stick particularly. And I mean, that was one of the great things when we first sort of thought about doing Virtual Cop. We did that because we'd been given a prototype of the N64 controller, which had the little stick on the top, the analog stick, and we thought, well, this is perfect for aiming, because originally we said, about Virtual Cop, the great thing about that was you had the gun, which you pointed at the screen, and said, well, we won't have that. But if you've got this thumbstick, then suddenly you've got a pointer, and so that could work really well. And so we spent an enormous amount of time playing with different setups, and again with the slidey thing. So we thought, well, for us that felt natural. And I mean, obviously, you don't use those kinds of controls anymore, but at the time that just felt, you can hide behind a wall and slide out and then aim the thing and shoot someone. It's like, well, that feels really good. And obviously we played a lot with the auto aim support as well to make it work. But yeah, that sort of that controller and that sort of feel of it, and it just worked well, we thought.
Yeah, as time's gone on, GoldenEye has always had this thing where people say, oh, it's amazing, but there's always this, yeah, but it doesn't control very well if you play it. Because obviously when we were making it, there was no accepted convention for how you would do those controls. And also there's only one analog stick. So the controls are what they are. And we tried every combination under the sun. And I think the default controls for GoldenEye are the right controls. But you always had this niggling thing of people kind of going, yeah, but it doesn't stand up if you play it today. It's like it controls really badly. It's the frame rate was terrible. But the XBLA reissue, essentially it's the same game code. It's the same. Everything's the same, but it's hitting consistently a good frame rate, and you can play it with dual analog. And lots of people saying, actually, you know what, it plays really well. So that's a nice thing to get that kind of out there. And it always kind of rankled with me, that whole thing, like, yeah, well, it was good for its time, but it doesn't stand up. I think it does stand up.
When most people think of GoldenEye, they think of multiplayer. The multiplayer mode was, quite astonishingly, added very late as April 1997, 4 months before the game's release. It must have at one point been a 2-player multiplayer mode, as we can see from early promotional videos. The addition of a multiplayer mode made GoldenEye a must-own game, and the 4 controller ports of the Nintendo 64, a feature which Rare were instrumental in implementing, made it the go-to local multiplayer game for years.
I think the multiplayer was its USP. That was the thing that sold it. Prior to that, there's no online. If you want to play a LAN game, you've got to bring a whole bunch of stuff. It's an absolute nightmare. Whereas this was, perfect for college dorms and stuff. Grab your N64, grab your controllers. You don't need anything else. Go for it. I remember at Rare, Tim Stanford was always very cynical about the idea that you would have this game, which was a kind of competitive first-person game, but everyone could see everyone else's screen. It just makes it different. Famously, it didn't get put in until very late in the day, and was always kind of like a stretch goal. I don't remember there ever being any kind of design for the multiplayer or list of things we would have, but it was just like, or what can we possibly do? So and then all of those things like the game modes, like the Golden Gun, the only level 20, they're all just completely freewheeling, brainstorming. What can we do and how can we make it themed at all to Bond in some way?
we were of that generation that, you know, split screen had come in a bit before, and we had the power to do 4-player split screen, and we just had so much, you know, and we'd done a lot of that while we were developing. We were playing a lot of Doom, network Doom, and we were playing these other, you know, these flight simulators and things where we were shooting each other down in tank ones. And our big lunchtime game was Bomberman, which we absolutely love, 4-player Bomberman, all on one screen. And the fun with that was just, you know, absolutely ripping each other to bits. Duncan in particular would take his losses very bad. I mean, I was crap at it anyway, so I knew I was going to lose. But Duncan would get particularly upset about it. And there was that whole, you know, people getting really annoyed and gagging up on each other. That sort of 4 people around a screen is still brilliant. Obviously, it's well known that GoldenEye, we didn't actually tell Rare for a while that we were making a multiplayer split screen version. We did that evenings privately to get it running first to check that it was fun. And when we first presented it, there were quite a few people saying, well, you can see the other person's screen, so it's not going to work. But actually, you know, we know it doesn't make any difference at all. It's perfectly good. You know, you're busy looking at your screen. Maybe you do glance at the other screen from time to time to see where someone is, but it doesn't detract from the game. So, you know, there was a lot of concern that it wouldn't, 4-player split screen on a first-person shooter wouldn't work, and it totally does. The multiplayer gave it legs, so people weren't trading it in. I mean, that was the big thing with other games. People would play it and then they trade it in. Whereas people were clearly keeping hold of their GoldenEye copies because they were playing it multiplayer again and again and again with their mates.
That was kind of when we started to realise that the game was going to be, people wouldn't think it was crap. Because we were always incredibly self-critical. So when the multiplayer was in, just everyone at Rare wanted to play it. So, you know, there was a black market between the teams at Rare that, you know, GoldenEye team would supply ROMs to other teams for playing out of hours. The Killer team, I think, well, they were probably, they might have been the Conquer team by then. So Chris Seaver, Chris Tilston, all those guys, they used to play Bond. Chris Tilston on the team, who was kind of like the lead designer or whatever, he was always boasting about being better at it than everyone else. So we did a special version that changed his hitbox on his dev kit so that he just always lost, basically. It was as a wind-up.
From our point of view, it was a no-brainer because we'd had so much fun playing these other multiplayer games, and we thought we just have to. And I remember all of us were sitting around, and the discussion was like, well, I think looking at the performance, you know, I think we can do a split screen 4-player, and it shouldn't hurt the performance too much. And it was Steve Ellis, obviously, who went off. He joined the team a bit later, and it was one of the first things I think he was asked to work on by Mike. Said, look, just go and see if you can get this running split screen and see what it does. And I mean, Steve's an awesome programmer, and he came off, and literally within a couple of hours, it was running 2-player split screen. It's like, why can we do 4-player? Yeah, we can do 4-player too. And it's like, okay. And then it was like, okay, Karl, can you start making an environment specifically for this that's a bit cheaper, that can run to these sorts of specs? So I started building that, and you know, within 2 or 3 days, we had a multiplayer, an early version of the complex running and playing. And it's like the secret hiding places in the complex, things like that. You know, that was purely came out of me cheating because I was getting my ass handed to me playing the multiplayer, and they put the radar on, and I really hated that because it showed you where you were. So I thought, well, if they're going to cheat by doing that, then I'm going to cheat. So I went and changed the backgrounds and built in these little hut cubbies with the one-way walls, which you could do, and didn't tell anyone. And they couldn't work out that evening we were playing, and no one could work out how I kept coming out from places they didn't know I was and killing them from behind. And then it stayed in the game because I was saying, actually, that's really funny. We just leave it in, you know. So they went. So it's like having that ability to play the game with each other and make really quick changes. And that was done in one afternoon. It was like, right, tonight, I know we're going to be playing the complex tonight. I'm going to change it, and I'm going to put these little cubby holes in there, and I'm going to hide in them and come out and kill people. Complex. It was the test one that we built. If you look at it, it's got pretty much every idea under the sun in it because it was just me trying everything out. So there's a room full of columns, and there's things that overlook other spaces, and there's narrow bits and there's open bits, and it was designed to be super cheap so it would run as fast as possible because I knew we had 4 players, split screen with guns and bombs going off. So it's fundamentally a black and white level because it uses intensity textures because that was the biggest res I could get, and it was stuck onto very large simplified polys to try and keep the count down to the minimum. So in that sense, it's probably the purest, of the levels. I mean, there's other ones that look a lot better. I love the Aztec level. I've had so much fun doing that level because of all the Moonraker stuff, which is one of my favorite Bond movies. But, that one's the purest in that sense. It was just like, this is so much fun. And we were playing it in the evenings, and then I think it was Simon Farmer came over, who was the production manager at Rare, and he saw us playing this, and he's like, "What's the hell's that?" And it's like, "Oh, it's got 4-player split screen." And he's like, "You're wasting your time making a multiplayer version. You haven't even got the main game done yet." And as soon as it went to Nintendo and they saw it, they're like, "Yeah, that's great." Which is probably, why they, in the end, it was like, okay, however long it takes to make this good, fine, we'll cope with it, because they could see that it was just fun.
Whether it was the single player or multiplayer mode, the team spent a great deal of time playing GoldenEye during its development, reacting to these play sessions.
So with the single player stuff, the story stuff, I flatter myself that I probably was quite a good judge of what was going on, because those story, the level setups, I would just play them to death before they went anywhere near testing. Certainly one thing was we were really worried that the game would just feel very samey all the way through. So trying to make different levels play in different ways. So the silo is very much a prolonged corridor shooter kind of thing with interesting, you come in and there's some guys and boxes and stuff, whereas other levels are more kind of freeform, off necessity, particularly the exterior levels like the 7i exteriors and things. We always thought they were crap, because it's basically you're in a huge big room that's pretending to be a snowy environment, and these guys, all they can do is come at you, but you're trying to moderate it in ways that make it feel like it's a bit more kind of, there aren't just a whole bunch of people running at you out of the dark trying to kill you.
So I think Rare was probably used to working in that kind of way, where you would try ideas and iterate, and when you find something that's good, then you keep going with it. Yeah, I think that process probably came from Nintendo as well, because I think that's how they work on all their games. It's really from trying things and iterating on ideas that you find out what's really good for the player and what's fun.
By the end, and I'm talking now sort of spring 97, I could actually load the game up in my room, play the levels, and write to that, and that made so much more sense, and it was so much, it just helped so much more. Obviously the best way to do it is to be able to play the game whilst you're writing the piece and listen to it, see what's working and stuff, but we don't always get that luxury, and it certainly is a luxury of being an in-house composer, which is quite rare, no pun intended.
I've said it before, one of the reasons I think GoldenEye played well in the end was because we got it running very early, and we sent lots of builds over to Mario Club in America, in Nintendo in Seattle, and they loved it, and they would send us back loads and loads of comments, oh, we should do this and we should try that, and how about this? There was just lots of time to iterate and to play around with things, and that's the great secret to good game design is, make sure you get to play your game a lot before you release it.
Well, almost all of them played it.
No, never played it. I'm not a gamer. I put my all into everything I was doing, but I didn't know anything about game dynamics. I still don't. So, leave that to the people that do.
One of GoldenEye's features came partly as a result of these gameplay sessions, as well as the unique structure of the difficulty levels. The team wanted to include cheats, and assigning target times to each level seemed like a great pathway to unlocking them.
So it had to be done right near the end of testing, when the levels were actually complete. Whichever tester, either at Rare or Nintendo, who could get through that level the fastest, and so the fastest times were based on those.
They deliberately made the runway level the easiest time to achieve, so that the player would unlock it without even trying, and then hide the more desirable cheats behind times which were trickier to beat.
It's your first sample of the drugs is free. Put it in your top pocket, take that home with you. It's a strong design principle with rewards and games. And then you feel ownership. It's like, oh, I did that. And also, I wasn't even trying. I bet you I'm really good at this. I don't know whether the times came before the cheats or the times were a consequence of wanting to have something to unlock the cheats. Because obviously there's no score. I think, again, I think we inadvertently invented speedrunning because it was a thing. The game actually encouraged you to speedrun and records it on the cartridge what your time is, so it's a verifiable thing. And then the cheats were just anything that anyone could think of. I think it's also really interesting that we had that thing where, because it only records the times to the second, it just creates this wonderful uncertainty as to, so you've got these things like, all these records where it's like, well, the record is, I don't know, like 32. But we know we can get 31 because if you look at the time, it's actually people are doing 31.2, but it's probably more interesting than if it gave you it to 2 decimal places, because it becomes much more an event. Whenever someone rolls back one of those speedrun times by a second, and that record has stood for 5 years or something, it's a big event.
Speedrunning has given GoldenEye longevity uncommon to most games, with a community that's still very active to this day. When it was finally released after around 3 years of development, GoldenEye was an absolute smash.
007 GoldenEye.
A licensed game which against the odds became the Nintendo 64's most successful non-first party game and 3rd best selling overall, selling over 8 million copies, being trumped only by Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart in sales. But this success was a bit of a slow burner.
The story I heard was that Nintendo had picked the license up pretty cheap because they hadn't made a James Bond movie for 4 years because there had been some legal dispute. Movie tie-ins for games were traditionally just awful anyway. They'd all been, everyone that was just, most of them were terrible, and so there wasn't a lot of appetite for doing it. So they picked it up cheap. They'd offered it to Rare. Rare had offered it to Martin. Martin had said, "Well, I'll only do it if it's an N64 game." Or when Martin came to see me about it in the first place and said, "Are you interested in Bond?" On the one hand, I said, "Yeah, absolutely, love it, and yeah, I'd love to make a Bond game." But I remember we were working in the block next to the team that were making Blast Corps, and I remember looking at what they were doing and thinking, "Oh, that's great! their own IP, and it's going to be a Rare game, Nintendo game, and it looks really fun." And we were working on a movie tie-in, and I was thinking, "God, we've got it's like," and I was loving doing it, but I thought, we've got an uphill struggle here. We were all students, we were fresh out of university, that been given to a bunch of people who never made a game before, which kind of tells you what the expectation was. It wasn't given to their best team; it was given to the newbies who'd never made anything before. We were definitely the least glamorous project in the whole of the company when it started, and for most of it, even then, Rare were busy making all these really fun, brightly coloured kids games, Blast Corps and Jet Force Gemini and Diddy Kong Racing, and these sort of things. And we were making this dark, gritty first-person shooter. We went to E3 2 years in a row, and it was both the years I think that it was in Atlanta rather than LA for a change. They'd done, Nintendo. Had quite a decent chunk of the Nintendo stand, and they'd done a nice. Recreated some of the backdrops and stuff. They'd done a really great job on it, and we were just there standing around watching people. We hadn't seen a lot of people playing it other than ourselves and a few people at Rare, so just the chance to watch people come in and play it was great. And it wasn't a pick up and play game like a lot of Nintendo games. You had to learn. First of all, they had the controller you could see people were taking a while to get the hang of it, and I remember spending quite a lot of time with new players explaining to them how to move and shoot and stuff. But after a couple of days, a lot of people coming to saying, played GoldenEye, and then they'd say, "Oh, did you work on the game? Love it, brilliant, fantastic, really enjoyed it." So you sort of, it's a small group of people, but you came away thinking, okay, the people who are playing it like it, and they're spending time with it. So that was really sort of encouraging, and then we went back and finished it off, and it launched, and and the first Christmas it obviously sold. They didn't make enough, and it sold out, which on the one hand was great, but on the other hand, we didn't know if it has kind of missed its sort of chance. And then the next E3 we went back, and they still they had it back on the stands again, and just crowds of people all around playing it and playing the deathmatch on it, and just thinking, "Oh, this is great, people really like it," and so yeah, it was fabulous to get that first sort of public affirmation that people who hadn't played it before were playing it and getting into it and enjoying it. It's a nice feeling to see people enjoying something you created.
The E3, we all went to E3 '97. And it was really strange because we had, there was like about 8 booths or something it was on Nintendo, so it was quite prominent. It would start up in the morning, it would just have the dam level unlocked, and then they go, "Oh, that's really, I love it, great demo." And we say, "Well, you can play the rest of it." And I think people were really surprised that it was, it wasn't just this part of the game. It's like was the whole thing. And again, the multiplayer and stuff. And I remember we did have like PC gamers who would have come to scoff, eventually coming later in the over the 3 days to playing it. Actually, this is really good.
It's a funny one. It did well from the start, but they didn't. I remember there was a bet between a couple of the senior Nintendo executives about how many it would sell before Christmas, and one of I think it was Ken Lobb bet it would break 1 million, and the other hand, and they only made about 1 million cartridges. and then it sold out really quickly. And we had no idea what to expect, but we thought, well, 1 million cartridges in the first few months, and the Nintendo 64 hadn't been out for that long then, so it was clearly selling. Pretty much everyone who was buying the console was picking up GoldenEye at the same time, so that was like, okay, this is good. It was the early days of the internet as well, so very early days of the internet, so there were just a few sort of gaming forums setting up where people would chat, and then we were getting all this feedback that people couldn't get it because it sold out everywhere. And there were stories of people in North America crossing into Canada because they found a store that had a couple of copies, and we were sort of, on the one hand, really pleased, and on the other hand, really frustrated. It's like, well, because we were on royalties, we would get a bonus based on the sales. It's like, well, they're not selling any because they've sold out. So sold out really quickly and then dived because there was none available. But as soon as they made more, then it sold again. And yeah, I think what was interesting then was that it sold the next quarter. We got quarterly statements of how many it sold, and we figured it would die off pretty quickly. But yeah, every quarter a new statement came through, and it sold another 1 million, and then it sold another 1 million, and then it sold 1.5 million.
The second year it sold more than the first year, and the third year it sold more than the first 2 years combined. Like, how did games never do that, right? When I moved to America, I realised that in the college dorms, GoldenEye was the game that all the guys were playing, right? That was a college dorm game. Everyone played it. Like, you mentioned GoldenEye. Everyone I meet in the street who did GoldenEye, they know that more than Banjo-Kazooie. I think I got dragged off it, and you just forget how successful it was and how it really changed first-person shooters forever. Like, that whole stealth thing wasn't there till GoldenEye did it. Make a lot of noise, they're going to come find you and kill you. That's in every single first-person shooter that you find now, but it was GoldenEye first, It's amazing to be associated with it, and I loved all that music. It was great fun.
Part of its success was thanks to Ken Lobb at Nintendo of America, who championed GoldenEye right through its development. Ken's name was the inspiration for the Klob, the mostly useless submachine gun. Ken struck a deal with Blockbuster whereby they could return rental copies of GoldenEye if it wasn't popular.
But get real, you'd rather be playing video games. You can rent them from Blockbuster.
Ken Lobb was kind of like the guy who was almost like an honorary member of Rare. He had some input into the marketing and stuff in the States, and he got NOA to supply copies to Blockbuster for free for rental, just because he knew that if people played it, they'd want to buy it.
People like Ken Lobb over in America, who was a big fan of the game and the team, and kept batting for us over there, saying, no, let them finish it, it'll be good in the end, so those sorts of people are really critical, and yeah, we made a good game, but we wouldn't have got it out if all those other people in the Rare and the Nintendo hadn't had the confidence, and the backing. So yeah, that Rare Nintendo relationship was really important.
None of the rental copies were returned, and it ended up being the #1 rented game for 3 years.
So in the States, they had rental charts for all the different games. So like renting out cartridges for the weekend or whatever was a really big thing over there. And they just had these rental charts going, and it just seemed to go on for months, where GoldenEye was always like the highest rental. And so presumably people just keep renting it to play multiplayer. So that was always really cool to hear about.
GoldenEye went on to win several awards, including a BAFTA, and was nominated for 7 Interactive Achievement Awards, winning 4.
I can remember when the team went to the BAFTA Awards, and I can remember going to the E3 Awards, which was absolutely phenomenal, because we just won category after category after category. They're the sort of like game Oscars, and we won just about everything. I think we came away with 6 that night.
So that was a glimpse into the development of one of gaming's defining titles. Thanks to an extremely talented and dedicated team, GoldenEye solidified its rightful place in the pantheon of video games.
My mother was a nurse, and she helped people get better, and my father built buildings for people to live in, and they're still standing in places, and I make video games, which is, feels like a very pointless, ephemeral thing. But when you make a game like GoldenEye, and clearly so many people bought it and enjoyed it and loved it and still love it, it's nice to know that you had that. I suppose it's like someone who writes a really good song that keeps getting played on the radio year after year after year. It's music, pretty much last forever because the technology doesn't matter so much, but with a video game it does. But so if you make a game that has a bit of longevity in it, then you feel really honoured and surprised.
The fact that I'm talking to you today just goes to show how lucky I was to have been involved in that project. It's wonderful that people are interested after all this time.
And now, I've gone to kind of like retro shows and stuff and things, and it's still highly sought after. It's a shame that that's kind of lost from the games world now, but that whole thing of printed parts and manuals and a cartridge and stuff and things are really very special, and it's a great privilege to have been part of that.
I've got such fond memories of being at Rare back in that day. I just couldn't believe I was there. Rare was just a spectacular thing to be part of that in that kind of golden age of Rare, before Microsoft bought it. Just spectacular.
GoldenEye's influence on gaming, particularly first-person shooters, is undeniable, and its legacy is still going strong today. Thank you very much for watching.